Hello, and welcome to The Story of Rhode Island, the podcast that tells you the story of Rhode Island's fascinating history. In Season 2, we witness America's smallest colony come of age and grow into an economic powerhouse. Not only did Rhode Island's hinterlands become fully developed, but its network of trade expanded well beyond its borders. But unfortunately, there's an ugly truth lurking behind the story of economic prosperity. Because the fact is that throughout the 18th century, Rhode Island's economy was built on the back of slavery. Not only did their citizens make massive fortunes by trafficking enslaved Africans abroad, but their towns and plantations at home were also highly dependent on the labor of enslaved men and women. But that's just part of the story, because Rhode Island's ties to slavery run much deeper than just what took place during the 18th century. Enslaved people had been living in the colony since its very founding, and its citizens continued to profit off of the business of slavery right up until the Civil War. And so, since Rhode Island and this horrific institution remained intertwined for over 2 centuries, we'll explore the history of that connection from start to finish via this 2-part bonus episode. As we jump into Part 1, we witness the birth of Rhode Island's involvement in slavery. We do so by visiting Roger Williams on a June day in 1637. Behind Williams is Providence, the town that he founded a little more than a year earlier, after his radical belief in religious freedom got him banned from Massachusetts. At the moment, Williamstown is but a minor English settlement situated on land that is still dominated by the region's indigenous people. Providence's population of about 100 religious outcasts is dwarfed by the over 20,000 indigenous people living in the area. Other than Providence, William Blackstone's farm in present-day Cumberland, and the trading posts used by Roger Williams and Richard Smith in present-day Wickford, the land that we know today as Rhode Island is ruled by 2 tribes, the powerful Narragansett Nation located to the west in Narragansett Bay, and the Poconokeets to the east. As a 31-year-old Roger Williams stands on the southern tip of his newly created town, he looks south towards the Providence River. His young eyes, having yet to be weakened by old age, clearly make out the English vessel heading towards him. With the sloop bobbing up and down on the bay's choppy waters, Williams notices that while some of the people on the boat are other English colonists, many of them are members of the Pequot tribe. When the vessel finally arrives at Williams' small settlement, he sees that the Pequot people are bound together by chains and shackles. For the past year, the Pequot tribe located in present-day southeastern Connecticut has been at war with the English, and it's become quite clear that they're bound to lose this war. Although the people on the boat are lucky to have survived the fighting, they are about to be sold off into a life of servitude. And while most of them will live that life in either Massachusetts, Connecticut, or Plymouth Colony, at least one of them will remain in Providence. Because the man that we know today as the founder of Rhode Island is about to acquire one of these captives, teaching us that slavery has existed in Rhode Island since the very beginning, back when it was merely a tiny English settlement in a world surrounded by indigenous villages. But this is just the start, because as new English settlements emerge around Narragansett Bay and they unite into the colony of Rhode Island, its network of trade will expand into new markets. When this happens, the Rhode Islanders will realize that not only can indigenous war captives be beneficial to their economy, but so can enslaved men and women from Africa. And because of this discovery, Rhode Island will begin to absolutely dominate the African slave trade in America, and it will participate in its human trafficking activities far more than any other American colony. On top of that, its towns and plantations back home will become more dependent on the free labor of enslaved Africans than any other society in New England. The story of how Rhode Island became so embedded in the most horrific institution ever created is what we'll cover in Part 1 of this 2-part bonus episode of the Story of Rhode Island podcast. With the cloudy summer sky sitting over Narragansett Bay, Roger Williams makes his way down present-day South Main Street in Providence. Standing in the street are the same group of Pequot captives he watched travel up the Providence River earlier that day. These non-combatants, a group of people consisting of women, children, and village elders, had no involvement in the Pequot War, but nonetheless, they will be punished for their tribe's decision to go to war with the English by being sold off into a life of servitude. Williams watches as English soldiers tug on the captives' chains, ensuring they are tightly secured to the carts and wagons that will eventually lead them to Boston. As he observes the captives, he finds a small part of himself conflicted by how they are being treated. Unlike most of his fellow colonists, he sees the indigenous people as more than just a group of heathen savages, and has learned to respect their way of life. He even has hope that over time the English and indigenous people of New England will find a way to live together in harmony, and develop a society that enables them to flourish together as one. It's due to this sentiment and a few other reasons why at first Williams had concerns about the English selling off non-combatants into a life of servitude. But after turning to the Bible for guidance, he's come to justify the enslavement of these war captives. To show his support for the practice, he's been helping his English neighbors track down Pequot people who managed to escape this horrific fate. And, as we're about to see, he's recently found a way to justify the enslavement of these people, enough to rationalize his direct involvement in the practice as well. As Williams continues to eye the Pequot people, he comes across a young boy who appears to be in good health. After approaching the boy and his mother, he begins to have a conversation with the two of them. He learns that they are from the Pequot village of Sesquasket, which is located near present-day Fairfield, Connecticut. He's happy to find out that the boy's father chose not to fight against the English, giving him hope that the boy will be of mild temper. But as the English soldiers begin escorting the captives out of Providence and towards Boston, the founder of Providence decides that he would like to take the boy in as his servant. Therefore, in a hasty act to claim the boy as his own, he grabs a red scarf from his pocket and loosely wraps it around the boy's neck. Then, he returns home to write a letter to the governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop, asking if he could keep the boy as his servant. Within just a few weeks, Winthrop accepts Williams' request, and the boy is separated from his mother and sent to live with Williams. When he arrives, the boy is renamed Will, and he goes on to labor away for Williams without pay for years to come, making this one of the first instances of slavery in Rhode Island history. And as the war continues to come to an end, other of Rhode Island's earliest settlers also purchase some of these captives so that they can be their slaves as well. Now, it's important to note that the Pequot war captives are not only distributed to English households. Since the Narragansett tribe sided with the English during the war, they too are allowed to claim some of the Pequot people as servants. However, the life that the Pequots live with the Narragansetts differs vastly from those who live with the English. Although not exactly treated as equals, they are incorporated into the tribe in a far more humane manner. The Narragansett sachems are known to give these non-combatants houses, goods, and even land to grow crops on. They balk at the idea of treating these individuals as slaves. But unfortunately, many are not so lucky, and most are sent to live with the English. And as the years pass, new towns emerge around Narragansett Bay, and a stabilized economy is finally developed, enabling even more of Rhode Island's earliest settlers to purchase these captives as slaves. But then, only about a decade after becoming a colony, something remarkable happens. Something that acts as a blimp of hope in this primarily dark tale. In 1652, the colony's government, led by Samuel Gorton, somebody you might remember from Season 1, passes a law making lifelong slavery illegal. They do so by stating that no person can be bound in servitude for longer than 10 years. This law is an extremely radical act, as it is the first ban on slavery in American history. Because keep in mind that at the time, slavery is not seen as some moral wrong that needs to be made right. Nobody in America is shouting from the mountaintops saying that enslaved people must be emancipated. No, instead, it's simply a part of life. It's an institution that's as old as time, and one that's been adopted by societies throughout the world. Places like Greece, Rome, ancient Egypt, China, sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and even the Americas before the arrival of Europeans were all known to have slaves. This might lead you to ask, well, then what could have inspired these early Rhode Islanders to pass such an incredibly progressive act? Unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure, but if I had to guess, I would say that it's probably tied to how they interpreted the Bible. But either way, the law is an incredible piece of legislation, and something that should be admired. It once again proves just how progressive some of the early Rhode Island colonists were. Unfortunately, legislation passed but not enforced is nothing more than words on a piece of paper. And that's exactly what the law amounts to. At the time that the law is being passed, the Rhode Island colony is in shambles, and the government is split in two. There's one government that controls the towns of Providence and Warwick. That's the one led by Samuel Gorin. And then there's another that oversees the towns of Newport and Portsmouth. Because of this, the island towns completely ignore the law, and even many of the mainland residents give it little respect. To make it worse, the law only prevents black and white people from being enslaved. It says nothing about indigenous people. And so, as the colony continues to grow, so do the number of enslaved people purchased by these early Rhode Islanders, albeit somewhat slowly. But then, with the final quarter of the century having just begun, something happens that drastically increases the number of enslaved indigenous people living in the colony. Following decades of rising tensions between the English and the tribes of New England, a war breaks out between the two parties in 1675. The conflict is known as King Philip's War, or as it's also called, Metacom's Rebellion, and it forces the Narragansett and Pokanoket people to take up arms against their English neighbors. And if you're interested in learning more about this tragic event, then I'd suggest listening to episodes 8 and 9 of Season 1. But for now, just know that King Philip's War absolutely decimates southern New England. English towns and indigenous villages throughout Rhode Island are burnt to the ground, and the Rhode Islanders' once peaceful coexistence with the Narragansett and Pokanoket people becomes a thing of the past. When the dust settles and the English end up coming out victorious, the people of Rhode Island find themselves looking for payback. Even Roger Williams, the man who was banned from Massachusetts partially due to his willingness to defend the rights of the Narragansett and Pokanoket people, has found himself forever changed by the war. And so, with revenge driving their decision-making, the people of Rhode Island decide that the Narragansett and Pokanoket people deserve the same treatment as the Pequot captives decades earlier. This marks an important transition in our story, as it will thrust many of the people who originally inhabited the land that we now know as Rhode Island into a life of slavery. As we revisit Providence on a summer day in 1676, we witness his period of anger and resentment, and learn about how the founder of Rhode Island played a leading role in enslaving the same people he once worked so hard to defend. Scattered throughout the town of Providence are the ashes and burnt wood from the buildings that were destroyed during King Philip's War. The conflict was so destructive that not one of the 50 or so homes or small shops that once stood along present-day North and South Main Street survived today. But such a fate was not unique to Rhode Island's first town, as other places like Warwick, Wickford, and Patuxent were also raided by Narragansett warriors. An act of retaliation spurred on by the English's decision to ruthlessly massacre hundreds of Narragansett people at the Great Swamp in present-day South Kingstown. Not surprisingly, all of this fighting has filled the colonists with anger, an emotion that can be seen on Roger Williams' face as we revisit him in the town that he founded decades earlier. Williams, no longer the spry and hopeful man that he was during the Pequot War, is now an elderly man who's been hardened by the way things have turned out between the colonists and local indigenous people. Any hope he had of the two parties living together in harmony has evaporated completely. Surrounding Williams are the citizens of Providence, who at the moment are furiously glaring at a group of Narragansett people who were taken prisoner during the war. On this summer day, Williams and his fellow townsmen are meeting to determine what type of punishment these indigenous people will face. And Williams will play a major role in this decision, as he's the head of the committee that's tasked with determining the fate of indigenous war captives. With resentment filling their hearts, the people of Providence shout at the Narragansett people tied up in front of them. In the midst of all this shouting, one of the male colonists walks up to an injured Narragansett warrior, standing quietly in the back of the group. Without saying a word, he tensely inspects the warrior from head to toe while circling his weakened body. Then, as a look of both astonishment and anger emerges on his face, the colonist begins to point at the warrior and tells the people of Providence that that's him. That is the man who just months earlier helped lead the raid on their town. Without taking even a moment to question the man's accusation, the people of Providence become even more enraged and start to crowd around the warrior. As the English continue to threaten the Narragansett people, Williams realizes that things are getting out of hand, so he attempts to calm the people down. He tells them that he will set up a court to review the warrior's involvement in the war. When that court eventually takes place, the warrior will be found guilty and is executed by firing squad. And as for the other Narragansett prisoners who had no involvement in the war, even those far too young or far too old to be of any harm, Williams and his committee determined that they too must pay for the damage that their warriors have done. And so, by the end of August, the committee agrees to have these individuals sold off into servitude and the proceeds distributed amongst the people of Providence. The amount of time in servitude ranges anywhere from 7 to 30 years, depending on the person's age at the time. And with their fate now determined, the captives are rounded up onto a ship captained by William's son and shipped off to Newport, where they are sold to either other colonies or Rhode Islanders themselves. Over time, more and more Narragansett people are captured, and the number of indigenous captives working in Rhode Island continues to grow. To add insult to injury, many of the Narragansett people are sold to Rhode Island families, moving to an area that had been ruled by the Narragansett tribe for generations. These colonists are a wealthy group of locals who want to use this land to support their agricultural goals. Eventually, these Rhode Islanders will become extremely successful in their endeavors. They will create massive plantations that span throughout present-day Washington County and develop the largest slave society in all of New England. But while we wait for that story to develop, we'll fast forward 20 years and take a look at a ship docking in Newport Harbor. The vessel's arrival thrusts us into the darkest depths of this already gruesome tale and marks the beginning of a time when Rhode Island's connection with slavery is at its strongest. So follow me as we watch this little colony around Narragansett Bay become the largest trader of enslaved Africans in American history. It's a May afternoon in 1696. And inching its way into Newport Harbor is a ship captained by Thomas Windsor of Boston, Massachusetts. The ship is known as the Seaflower, and unbeknownst to its captain, its arrival will represent a turning point in Rhode Island history. As Captain Windsor begins docking the Seaflower against one of the wharfs, the people of Newport pass by the ship without giving it any attention. Over the past several years, Newport's economy has flourished, so the sight of a merchant vessel is anything but uncommon. However, the locals find themselves becoming increasingly interested in the Seaflower when a group of 47 enslaved Africans are escorted off of the ship. With more and more locals turning their attention towards the Seaflower, the men in shackles are lined up in an orderly fashion, while Captain Windsor keeps a close eye on their whereabouts. These men are certainly not the first enslaved Africans the people of Newport have ever seen, as enslaved blacks have been working in Rhode Island for decades now. But these men, the ones now standing warily on a wharf in Newport, are different. Unlike the current enslaved people living in Rhode Island, who are the offspring of black or indigenous families already living in New England, these enslaved people have come directly from Africa, putting the Rhode Islanders face to face with the horrors of the slave trade. With the men and women in shackles, clearly beaten down by the suffocating and highly unsanitary conditions they've been living in for the past several months, the locals find themselves shocked to see just how damaging the trip from Africa has been on their bodies. With food and water having been scarce in their journey, the ship's crew hoarded this vital resource while only giving the enslaved men and women enough nutrients to survive. And because of this treatment, many of them now struggle to stand upright as they wait to be escorted off the dock. But nonetheless, these poor individuals are seen nothing more than a piece of property, so they receive no sympathy from the locals. Instead, they're bid on by the colony's wealthiest businessmen and planters who have just arrived at the wharf. Eventually, 14 of the captives are purchased for 30 to 35 British pounds, while the rest will be forced to march across miles and miles of public roads so that they can be sold in Boston. The arrival of the Seaflower is a moment that some consider to be the beginning of Rhode Island's direct involvement in the international slave trade. And now that they've started, they won't look back for over a century. The colony takes the next step forward just 4 years later, when 3 ships departing Newport become the first slaving vessels to leave from Rhode Island. Then, throughout the first 2 decades of the 18th century, the colony's merchants continue to test the profitability of these human trafficking activities. As the ships return from their journeys and their profits are analyzed, the merchants are thrilled to see just how substantial of a return that they've received on their investments. Before long, a growing amount of capital is thrust into the enterprise, and by 1725, the colony is fully engulfed in the slave trade. It gets to the point where almost every job in Rhode Island is in one way or another tied to this business. It begins with the colony's wealthiest individuals, men who use their excess capital to fund these voyages. These leading citizens employ shipbuilders, sail makers, and rope makers to construct these slaving vessels, enabling coastal towns like Newport to become a bustling epicenter for the American slave trade. But the reach of the slave trade isn't just confined to the coastline, as it expands into the hinterlands as well. Farmers in South County cultivate a wide range of goods that are sent out on these slave voyages. And to go along with those agricultural goods is a drink that's become quite popular on the African coast, Rhode Island rum. The spirit is in such high demand with African slave traders that distilleries begin popping up everywhere around Narragansett Bay, eventually growing to 33 in total. And since barrels are needed to transport the rum, a growing number of cask makers are employed as well. Finally, when the slaving vessels are built and the goods are ready to go, a captain and crew is hired to sail the vessel, while a person known as a supercargo manages the goods on board. Once that ship leaves Rhode Island, it begins its journey by heading southeast to West Africa, where the rum will be exchanged for enslaved Africans. Then, those enslaved people, along with the goods that were cultivated in Narragansett country, are brought back west to the Caribbean, where they are exchanged for molasses. Finally, the ship returns home, where any remaining enslaved Africans are sold, and the acquired molasses is used to create more rum that will once again be used in the slave trade. Due to the triangular route taken by these ships, the trade has aptly become known as the Triangle Trade. And while today we shun the idea of making money off of this despicable form of commerce, in 18th century Rhode Island, nobody but a few radical Quakers has any issue with the business. Instead, they find themselves addicted to the highly profitable trade, leading Rhode Island to become more embedded in it than any other American colony. To prove just how much of a leading role the colony takes in the slave trade, here are some astonishing statistics. And please, if you remember one thing from this episode, let it be these stats, as they do more to illustrate Rhode Island's ties to slavery than any scene I could create. Okay, so here we go. From 1726 to 1775, Rhode Island completes 506 slave trading voyages, while all of the other colonies combined complete just 178. And during that same time period, Rhode Island brings back over 57,000 enslaved Africans to the Americas, while all of the other colonies combined bring back fewer than 24,000. Or, if you want to look at it another way, from 1726 to 1775, America's smallest colony is responsible for about 70% of the slave trading activities done by the American colonies. Rhode Island plays such a dominant role in the slave trade that historian Jay Cawtrey has argued that the North American trade in slaves should really just be called the Rhode Island trade in slaves. And since some of these enslaved people make their way back to Rhode Island, the colony finds itself not only benefiting from trading enslaved people, but from the free labor they provide as well. To learn more about the lives of these poor individuals, we'll travel to a place we know today as South County, but at the time is commonly referred to as Narragansett country, due to the fact that the region was once ruled by the Narragansett people. And while we're there, we'll visit the Narragansett planters, the same English families who acquired Narragansett captives following King Philip's War so that they could work the land that their tribe used to rule. Only now, these wealthy farmers primarily rely on the labor of enslaved Africans. And by meeting the Narragansett planters, we give ourselves a more complete understanding of just how tightly intertwined 18th century Rhode Island was with the institution of slavery. Situated along the shores of Narragansett Bay, on a piece of land known as Cocumscussock, or what we refer today as Wickford, is the Updike family plantation in North Kingstown. The plantation and its endless miles of farmland has been passed down to the family for over 100 years. It began when one of the Updike's relatives, Richard Smith, moved to the area in the 1630s so that he could set up a trading post alongside Roger Williams. Unfortunately, his trading post was burned down by Narragansett warriors during King Philip's War, so his son, Richard Smith Jr., was forced to rebuild it in 1678. As the years passed, so many additions were added to it that it became known as Smith's Castle. And thanks to the tireless efforts of the Cocumscussock Association, this historic building still stands in North Kingstown today. Eventually, Smith passed away childless in 1692, so the trading post and the land it sat on was donated to his nephew, Lodowick Updike. Lodowick went on to turn it into a thriving plantation, which he passed on to his eldest son, Daniel. And as we visit Smith's Castle on a painfully warm summer day in 1750, we see Daniel Updike looking out towards a group of 5 enslaved men working on his plantation. In all, Daniel owns 19 enslaved people, making him one of the wealthiest Narragansett planters in all of South County. And scattered throughout the region are numerous other farms owned by Narragansett planters that are also worked by enslaved men and women. In fact, there are so many enslaved people in South County that about 30% of the county's population is enslaved. Because of the large number of enslaved people in this area, as well as cities like Newport and Providence, 10% of Rhode Island's population is enslaved. And to put that statistic into perspective, it's insightful to know that the New England colony with the second highest percentage of enslaved people is Connecticut with just 3%. After observing the men working in the field for a few more minutes, Daniel Updike decides that he's had enough of the sweltering heat, so he heads back inside. Unfortunately, the enslaved people baking under the relentless sun have no such option, so they continue on with their work. One of these men working is Prince Updike. Prince, like many of the other enslaved people owned by Daniel, has been given the family name, and he will pass it on to his children for generations, a pattern adopted by many other slave owners like the Hazards, Robinsons, and Potters. With his cheaply made shirt drenched in sweat and his muscles aching from the backbreaking labor that's been forced upon him, the nearly 40-year-old Prince takes a moment to catch his breath. As he stretches out his back and tilts his head side to side, he hopes that just for a moment he can alleviate some of the soreness in his body. While directing his vision north and south, he scans the miles and miles of farmland all around him. The Updike's plantation spans over 3,000 acres and consists of 5 different farms extending all the way north to Quinnesset and back down south to Hamilton. Prince and the 18 other enslaved people on that plantation work hard throughout the day so that the Updikes can produce cheese, crops, and a breed of horse known as the Narragansett Pacer, all of which will be shipped out and sold in the slave trade. And so although this painful truth paints a bleak picture, there is some hope to be found here. Eventually, Prince goes on to be emancipated from his life of slavery and moves to Newport, where he works as a chocolate grinder. And Prince manages to become so economically successful that when he dies in 1781, the wealth left by his estate affords him a handsome gravestone built at the Stevens Shop, a stone inscription business that's still in operation today. And Prince's grave also still stands today. It can be seen by visiting God's Little Acre in the Newport Burial Ground. And just like Prince, other enslaved people go on to be emancipated as well. Some gain their freedom when their owners choose to emancipate them upon their death. Other enslaved people manage to save enough money to actually buy their own freedom. And one especially brave group gains their freedom by joining the 1st Rhode Island Regiment during the Revolutionary War. To learn more about the latter group, listen to this season's episode about the Battle of Rhode Island. But of course, many are never emancipated, and instead, they spend their entire life living as a slave. A truth that, although hard to hear, is not one that all are willing to accept at the time. Because right around the time the Revolutionary War is beginning, one of Rhode Island's citizens has a revelation that opens him up to the evils of slavery. His name is Moses Brown, and this devout Quaker from Providence is about to go on a crusade against the evil institution. Moses and his fellow abolitionists will go toe-to-toe with some of slavery's most ardent supporters. And for a moment, it actually looks as though the abolitionists will find a way to break Rhode Island's ties with slavery once and for all. Unfortunately, that won't be the case. Because the state's leading citizens will not only break laws so that they can continue trafficking enslaved Africans, but they will become industry leaders in yet another business that supports this horrific institution, enabling Rhode Island to keep its ties with slavery alive right up until the outbreak of the Civil War. But that's a story for next time, on part 2 of this 2-part bonus episode of the Story of Rhode Island podcast. Thank you for listening to the Story of Rhode Island. If you are enjoying the podcast, please be sure to leave a review and to follow the podcast as well. If you'd like to learn more about today's episode and others as well, you can visit storyofrhodeisland.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at Story of Rhode Island or on Facebook at the Story of Rhode Island Podcast. Thank you again, and see you next time.